Welcome to Big Breaking News of America. Genesis Episode 14. Synthesis, the Primeval History's role in Genesis and the Torah. The Primeval History, Genesis 1:11, serves as the theological and narrative foundation of the book of Genesis and the Torah, presenting a universal account of humanity's origins, relationship with God, and moral trajectory before the particular story of Israel begins. Encompassing the creation of the world, Genesis 1:2, the fall and its consequences, Genesis 3:4, genealogies and cultural developments, Genesis 5:10, 11:10-26, the flood, Genesis 6:9, and the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11:1-9. These chapters address fundamental questions about existence, divine sovereignty, human nature, and the origins of diversity. The Primeval History establishes key themes: creation's goodness, sin's corruption, divine judgment and mercy, covenantal promise, and human responsibility, that resonate throughout the Torah and shape Jewish theology, ethics, and identity. As a literary and theological prelude, it bridges universal humanity to the particular covenant with Abraham, Genesis 12, setting the stage for Israel's mission to be a light to the nations, Isaiah 42:6. Rooted in ancient Near Eastern traditions and shaped by the exilic context, Genesis 1:11 engages universal concerns while asserting a monotheistic worldview, influencing Jewish tradition and global culture. This synthesis examines the Primeval History's narrative structure, theological contributions, historical and cultural significance, interpretive traditions, and enduring relevance, highlighting its pivotal role in Genesis and the Torah. 1. Overview and narrative structure of the Primeval History. The Primeval History, Genesis 1:11, is a cohesive unit within Genesis, structured to trace humanity's origins and moral decline while affirming divine sovereignty and redemptive purpose. Its narratives and genealogies form a literary arc that transitions from cosmic creation to the covenantal call of Abraham, serving as the Torah's foundational prologue. Key narratives and sections. Creation and order. Genesis 1:2. The Primeval History opens with two complementary creation accounts. The priestly account, Genesis 1:1-2:3, depicting God's orderly creation of the cosmos over 6 days, culminating in the Sabbath, and the Yahwist account, Genesis 2:4-25, focusing on humanity's creation and life in Eden. These establish creation's goodness and humanity's role as God's image bearers, Genesis 1:26-27. The fall and spread of sin, Genesis 3:4. The narrative shifts to human disobedience in the fall, Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve eat the forbidden fruit, introducing sin and death, followed by Cain's murder of Abel, Genesis 4, illustrating sin's escalation from disobedience to violence. These stories introduce the Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, and moral responsibility. Genealogies and cultural development, Genesis 5:10, 11:10-26. Genealogies trace humanity's continuity from Adam to Noah, Genesis 5, Noah's sons to the nations, Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, and Shem to Abraham's ancestors, Genesis 11:10-26. Cultural achievements, for example, city building, music, metallurgy, Genesis 4:17-22, highlight human creativity but are tainted by sin, as seen in Lamech's vengeance, Genesis 4:23-24. The flood narrative. Genesis 6:9. God's response to humanity's pervasive wickedness is a flood to destroy creation, sparing Noah, a righteous remnant, who builds an ark. Genesis 6:7. The waters recede, and God establishes the Noahide covenant with a rainbow sign, promising preservation. Genesis 8:9, renewing creation's mandate. The Tower of Babel and dispersion. Genesis 11:19. Humanity's unified attempt to build a tower to make a name. Genesis 11:4, reflects pride, prompting God to confuse their language and scatter them, explaining linguistic diversity and concluding the universal history. Structural features. The Primeval history is unified by the Toledo generations formula, for example, Genesis 2:4, 5:1, 10:1, 11:10, structuring Genesis into sections and marking transitions from cosmic to human history. This formula links the universal narratives to the patriarchal accounts. Genesis 11:27. The narrative arc follows a pattern of creation, corruption, judgment, and renewal. Creation's goodness, Genesis 1:2, is marred by sin. Genesis 3:4, judged in the flood. Genesis 6:9, and Babel. Genesis 11:19, and renewed through covenants. Genesis 9, foreshadowing Genesis 12. This cycle foreshadows the Torah's redemptive trajectory. The alternation of narrative, for example, creation, flood, and genealogy, for example, Genesis 5:10, creates a rhythmic structure, balancing storytelling with historical continuity, suited for oral tradition and communal recitation. Literary style. The Primeval history blends mythic and historical elements, using vivid imagery, for example, the garden, Genesis 2, the flood's waters, Genesis 7, poetic parallelism, for example, Genesis 1's refrains, and wordplay, for example, Adam/Adamah, Genesis 2:7, Babel/Balal, Genesis 11:9, to convey theological truths. Ambiguities, e.g., the sons of God, Genesis 6:2, the mark of Cain, Genesis 4:15, the tower's purpose, Genesis 11:4, invite interpretation, fostering rabbinic exegesis and philosophical reflection. The narrative's universal scope, addressing all humanity, contrasts with the particular focus of Genesis 12:50, creating a literary and theological bridge to the Torah's covenantal narrative. Two theological themes and significance. The Primeval history establishes the theological framework for Genesis and the Torah, introducing themes that shape Jewish theology and resonate throughout the Pentateuch. These themes address universal human concerns while preparing for Israel's covenantal mission. Creation's goodness and divine sovereignty. Genesis 1:2 affirms creation's inherent goodness, and God saw that it was good. Genesis 1:10, and God's sovereignty as the sole creator, contrasting with ancient Near Eastern polytheism. Humanity, created in God's image, Genesis 1:26-27, is entrusted with stewardship over creation. This theology underpins the Torah's laws, for example, Sabbath, Exodus 20:8-11, and prophetic visions, for example, Isaiah 65:17-25, emphasizing God's authority and creation's value. Cultural impact. Creation's goodness informs Jewish practices like Barakot, blessings, and Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and resonates in global environmental ethics and religious affirmations of life's sanctity. Sin and human responsibility. The fall, Genesis 3, introduces sin as disobedience, with the Yetzer Hara leading to consequences like death and toil. Sin escalates in Cain's murder, Genesis 4, Lamech's vengeance, Genesis 4:23-24, and humanity's wickedness, Genesis 6:5, illustrating its corrupting spread. God's warnings, for example, Genesis 4:7, sin is crouching at the door, affirm human free will and responsibility, a cornerstone of Torah ethics, for example, Deuteronomy 30:19. Cultural impact. The theme of sin shapes Jewish theology of repentance, Teshuvah, central to Yom Kippur, and influences global religious and secular reflections on moral accountability, from confession to psychological theories of guilt. Divine judgment and mercy. God's judgments, the expulsion from Eden, Genesis 3:24, the flood, Genesis 6:9, and Babel's dispersion, Genesis 11:19, address sin's disruption, reflecting divine justice. Yet, mercy tempers judgment, the clothing of Adam and Eve, Genesis 3:21, Cain's protective mark, Genesis 4:15, Noah's preservation, Genesis 8:1, and Babel's non-destructive scattering. This balance is a hallmark of Torah theology, seen in the covenantal promises, for example, Exodus 34:6-7, and prophetic calls for repentance, for example, Jonah 3:10. Cultural impact. Divine judgment and mercy inform Jewish practices like chaste, loving kindness, and global narratives of redemption, from religious forgiveness to restorative justice. Covenant and divine faithfulness. The Noahide covenant, Genesis 9:8-17, with the rainbow as its sign, is the Torah's first explicit covenant, promising creation's preservation despite human evil. It foreshadows the Abrahamic, Genesis 12:1-3, Mosaic, Exodus 19:24, and Davidic, 2 Samuel 7, covenants, establishing God's faithful commitment. The covenant's universal scope, encompassing all humanity and creation, sets the stage for Israel's mission to bless all nations, Genesis 12:3. Cultural impact. The covenant shapes Jewish Brit rituals, for example, circumcision, and liturgy, and influences global religious and ethical frameworks, from environmental stewardship to human rights. Human continuity and diversity. Genealogies, Genesis 5:10, 11:10-26, affirm human continuity despite sin, tracing the righteous line from Adam to Abraham. The Table of Nations, Genesis 10, celebrates humanity's unity and diversity, with 70 nations symbolizing completeness in Jewish tradition. The Babel narrative, Genesis 11:19, explains linguistic and cultural diversity as divine will, fulfilling the mandate to fill the earth, Genesis 9:1, while critiquing prideful unity. Cultural impact. Human continuity and diversity inform Jewish ethics of inclusivity, for example, Ger Toshav, Leviticus 19:34, and global multiculturalism, promoting unity amid difference. Transition to the covenantal narrative. The Primeval history's universal scope, addressing all humanity, culminates in the dispersion, Genesis 11:19, and Shem's genealogy, Genesis 11:10-26, narrowing to Abraham's call, Genesis 12:1-3. This transition frames Israel's covenant as God's plan to redeem a fallen world, a central Torah theme, for example, Exodus 19:5-6. The righteous figures, Adam, Enoch, Noah, foreshadow Abraham's faithfulness, linking universal and particular histories. Cultural impact. The transition shapes Jewish identity as God's chosen people, seen in liturgy and festivals, and influences global religious narratives of divine election, from Christianity to Islam. 3. Literary artistry and style. The literary artistry of the Primeval history enhances its theological impact, making it a compelling and enduring narrative. Its vivid imagery, structural symmetry, and stylistic features reflect oral tradition roots and engagement with ancient literary conventions. Mythic and narrative style. The Primeval history blends mythic and historical elements, using archetypal stories, for example, creation, flood, to address universal truths. Its narrative style, vivid, for example, the flood's waters, Genesis 7:11, yet concise, prioritizes theological meaning, suited for oral recitation. The alternation of narrative and genealogy creates a rhythmic structure, balancing storytelling with historical continuity, a hallmark of Genesis's style. Cultural impact. The mythic style ensures memorability, making Genesis 1:11 a staple in Jewish liturgy and global storytelling, from synagogue readings to epic literature. Imagery and symbolism. Vivid imagery. The garden, Genesis 2, the flood's ark, Genesis 6:9, the Babel Tower, Genesis 11:4, conveys theological truths. Symbols like the tree of knowledge, Genesis 3:6, the rainbow, Genesis 9:13, and the tower evoke creation, covenant, and human ambition, resonating in Jewish and global iconography. The imagery often recalls creation's chaos and order, for example, Genesis 1:2, 7:11. Linking the narratives to the Torah's theology of divine sovereignty. Cultural impact. The imagery inspires artistic and literary retellings, from medieval manuscripts to modern films, for example, Noah, 2014, and shapes theological reflections on creation and redemption. Wordplay and etiology. Wordplay, E.G. Adam/Adamah, man/ground, Genesis 2:7, Babel/Balal, confusion, Genesis 11:9, adds linguistic depth, often serving etiological purposes, explaining origins, like languages or death. This aligns with Genesis's role as a foundational text. Repetitive refrains, and God saw that it was good, Genesis 1, as God commanded, Genesis 7, create a liturgical rhythm, reinforcing divine authority. Cultural impact. Wordplay and etiology engage audiences, seen in Jewish midrash and global linguistic studies, ensuring the narrative's cultural endurance. Structural symmetry and ambiguity. The chiastic structures, E.G., creation/fall, Genesis 1:3, floods rise/recession, Genesis 6:9, Babel's unity/dispersion, Genesis 11:19, create narrative balance, emphasizing theological cycles of order, disruption, and restoration. Ambiguities, E.G. The serpent's identity, Genesis 3, Enoch's fate, Genesis 5:24, the tower's purpose, Genesis 11:4, invite interpretation, fostering rabbinic debate and philosophical reflection, a hallmark of Genesis's style. Cultural impact, the symmetry and ambiguity foster ongoing engagement, seen in Jewish Chevruta study and global discussions of theology, ethics, and anthropology. 4. Historical and cultural context. The Primeval history must be understood within its historical and cultural context, as it emerged in a world of ancient Near Eastern traditions and was likely shaped by the needs of ancient Israel, particularly during or after the Babylonian exile. Its engagement with neighboring cultures and exilic resonance reflect its purpose as a theological and cultural statement. Ancient Near Eastern parallels. The Primeval history engages Mesopotamian myths like Enuma Elish, creation, Gilgamesh, flood, and Enmerkar, language origins, adapting motifs to assert monotheism. Genesis 1's ordered creation counters Babylonian chaos, while the flood, Genesis 6:9, emphasizes moral judgment over polytheistic caprice. The ziggurat-like tower, Genesis 11:4, critiques Babylonian hubris, and genealogies, Genesis 5:10, echo Sumerian king lists but focus on human continuity, reflecting Israel's unique anthropology. The cultural achievements, Genesis 4:17-22, mirror Mesopotamian and Canaanite advancements, but their link to sin critiques prideful progress, a polemic against imperial cultures. Cultural significance, by engaging ancient Near Eastern traditions, Genesis 1:11 made its theology accessible while distinguishing Israel's faith, shaping its identity in a polytheistic world. Babylonian exile and priestly /Yahwist context. Scholars attribute Genesis 1:11 to a blend of priestly, P, and Yahwist, J, sources, with P.'s orderly style, for example, Genesis 1:5, and J.'s narrative vividness, for example, Genesis 2:4-11:19. Likely finalized during or after the Babylonian exile, 587-539 BCE, the Primeval history addressed exilic concerns of identity, judgment, and hope. The flood's renewal, Genesis 8:9, and Babel's dispersion, Genesis 11:19, mirrored Israel's exile and restoration aspirations, with Noah and Abraham as remnants of hope. The critique of Babylonian pride, for example, ziggurats, countered imperial claims, affirming Israel's God as sovereign. The universal scope resonated with the diverse Babylonian Empire, positioning Israel within God's global plan, critical for diasporic identity. Cultural significance, the exilic shaping made Genesis 1:11 a text of resilience, unifying Jews through a shared history and divine promise, vital in diaspora. Oral tradition roots. The Primeval history's rhythmic structure, vivid imagery, and wordplay suggest origins in oral tradition, likely recited in tribal or cultic settings to preserve theology and history. Its archetypal stories aided memorization, ensuring transmission. The transition to written form, possibly during the monarchic, c. 1587 BCE, or exilic period, preserved the narratives for communal study and worship, aligning with scribal practices in ancient Israel. Cultural impact. The oral-to-written development made Genesis 1:11 adaptable, from ancient storytelling to synagogue readings, partiio, ensuring its endurance in Jewish culture. Socio-political dynamics. The Primeval history's assertion of divine sovereignty challenged Babylonian and Egyptian cosmologies, positioning Israel's God as supreme. The Universal Covenant, Genesis 9, and diversity, Genesis 10, countered imperial unification, supporting Israel's distinct identity. The emphasis on human responsibility and ethical norms, for example, Genesis 9:5-6, reflected Israel's call to ethical living, for example, Leviticus 19:18, critical during political upheaval. Cultural impact. These dynamics shaped Jewish theology and ethics, influencing the Torah's laws and prophetic calls for justice, and resonating in modern discussions of global ethics and diversity. 5. Role in Genesis and the Torah. The Primeval history plays a pivotal role in Genesis and the Torah, serving as the theological and narrative foundation that frames Israel's story within a universal context. Its contributions are multifaceted, shaping the Torah's structure, theology, and ethical vision. Narrative foundation. Genesis 1:11 provides the backstory for Genesis 12:50, explaining the world into which Abraham is called. The fall and sin's spread, Genesis 3:4, create the need for redemption, addressed through Abraham's covenant, Genesis 12:1-3. The genealogies, Genesis 5:10, 11:10-26, link universal humanity to Abraham's line, framing Israel as part of God's plan for all nations, a theme developed in the patriarchal narratives, Genesis 12:50. The Toledo formula unifies Genesis, transitioning from cosmic, Toledo of heaven and earth, Genesis 2:4, to human, Toledo of Adam, Genesis 5:1, to covenantal, Toledo of Torah, Genesis 11:27, histories, structuring the book's narrative arc. Theological framework. The Primeval history establishes core Torah themes: God's sovereignty, Genesis 1, human responsibility, Genesis 3:4, judgment and mercy, Genesis 6:9, covenant, Genesis 9, and diversity, Genesis 10:11. These themes underpin the Torah's laws, for example, Exodus 20, covenants, for example, Exodus 19:24, and prophetic visions, for example, Deuteronomy 30. The Noahide covenant, Genesis 9:8-17, sets a universal ethical foundation, for example, sanctity of life, Genesis 9:6, expanded in the Mosaic covenant's particular laws, for example, Leviticus 17:11, linking universal and Israelite ethics. The transition to Abraham, Genesis 12, frames Israel's mission to bless all nations, fulfilling the Primeval history's universal vision, for example, Exodus 19:5-6. Ethical and legal precedents. The Primeval history introduces ethical norms: sanctity of life, Genesis 4:10, 9:6, moral responsibility, Genesis 4:7, and respect for creation, Genesis 9:1-7, that inform the Torah's legal codes, for example, Exodus 20:13, Leviticus 19:18. The Sabbath as roots in creation, Genesis 2:1-3, underpin its centrality in the Torah, Exodus 20:8-11, while the covenant's universal scope foreshadows the Torah's inclusive ethics, for example, Leviticus 19:34. Cultural impact. These precedents shape Jewish law, halakha, and ethics, influencing practices like Pikuach Nefesh and global human rights frameworks. Transition to Israel's story. The Primeval history's universal scope contrasts with the particular focus of Genesis 12 Deuteronomy, framing Israel's covenant as God's response to a fallen world. Abraham's call, Genesis 12:1-3, fulfills the hope implicit in Noah, Genesis 9, and the dispersion, Genesis 11:1-9. The righteous figures, Enoch, Noah, prefigure Abraham's faithfulness, while the genealogies ensure continuity to the covenantal line, linking universal and Israelite histories. Cultural impact. The transition reinforces Jewish identity as a covenantal people, seen in liturgy and festivals, and influences global religious narratives of divine election. 6. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations. The Primeval history's richness has inspired extensive Jewish interpretive traditions, from rabbinic exegesis to mystical theology, deepening its theological and cultural significance and ensuring its relevance across generations. Rabbinic exegesis. Bereshit Rabbah, c. 5th century CE, interprets Genesis 1:11 as a divine blueprint, with creation, Genesis 1:2, revealing God's sovereignty and the fall, Genesis 3, emphasizing Teshuvah. The flood, Genesis 6:9, and Babel, Genesis 11:1-9, illustrate judgment and mercy, urging ethical living, Genesis Rabbah 1:38. The Talmud, Sanhedrin 56ab, derives universal ethical laws, Noahide laws, from Genesis 9, extending the Primeval history's moral framework to all peoples, while figures like Enoch, Genesis 5:24, are models of piety. Rashi, 11th century, and Ramban, 13th century, emphasize the Primeval history's role in establishing God's authority and Israel's mission, linking it to the Torah's laws and covenants. Cultural impact. Rabbinic interpretations shape Jewish liturgy, for example, Bereshit readings, education, for example, Torah study, and ethics, for example, chaste, ensuring Genesis 1:11's vitality in communal life. Mystical perspectives. The Zohar, 13th century, views Genesis 1:11 as a cosmic drama, with creation reflecting the Sphirot, divine attributes, and the fall disrupting their harmony. The flood and Babel are tikkun, repair, processes, preparing for Abraham's restoration through Torah. The rainbow, Genesis 9:13, and dispersion, Genesis 11:1-9, symbolize divine unity and multiplicity, with Israel's covenant gathering scattered sparks of holiness. Cultural impact. Mystical readings enrich Jewish spirituality, influencing prayer, meditation, and festivals, appealing to those seeking deeper meaning in Genesis 1:11. Ethical and communal applications. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations inspire Jewish ethics, with Genesis 1:11 cited in Musar literature to promote humility, responsibility, and tikkun olam. The universal covenant underpins advocacy for peace and justice. The transition to Abraham encourages Jewish identity, seen in naming practices and liturgy, while the universal scope fosters interfaith dialogue. Cultural impact. These interpretations ensure Genesis 1:11's role in Jewish communal life, from ethical teachings to social justice initiatives, reinforcing its cultural vitality. 7. Engagement with ancient Near Eastern traditions. The Primeval History's dialogue with ancient Near Eastern traditions is critical, as it adapts and transforms familiar motifs to assert a monotheistic theology, shaping its historical and cultural significance. Mesopotamian context. Genesis 1:11 engages myths like Enuma Elish, creation, Gilgamesh, flood, and Atrahasis, humanity's origins, reworking them to emphasize one God's sovereignty, moral judgment, and covenant. The ziggurat-like tower, Genesis 11:4, critiques Babylonian pride, relevant in the exilic context. Genealogies, Genesis 5:10, echo Sumerian king lists, but their focus on human continuity and diversity reflects Israel's unique anthropology. Cultural significance. By engaging Mesopotamian traditions, Genesis 1:11 made its theology accessible while asserting Israel's faith, shaping its identity in a Babylonian milieu. Egyptian parallels. Egyptian creation myths, for example, Atom's emergence, parallel Genesis 1's ordered creation, but Genesis's monotheism and ethical focus distinguish it. The flood, Genesis 6:9, contrasts with Egyptian destruction myths, emphasizing covenantal renewal. The Primeval History's universal scope acknowledges Egypt's prominence, Genesis 10:6, but subordinates it to God's plan, reflecting Israel's theological distinctiveness. Cultural significance. These parallels ground Genesis 1:11 in a familiar milieu, making its theology relatable while asserting Israel's worldview. Canaanite influences. Canaanite myths, like Baal's battles, feature chaos and creation, but Genesis 1:11's monotheistic order and moral narrative distinguish it. The dispersion, Genesis 11:19, aligns with Israel's theology of diverse nations, contrasting with Canaanite tribalism. Cultural achievements, Genesis 4:17-22, may reflect Canaanite advancements, but their link to sin critiques regional pride. Cultural significance. The engagement with Canaanite motifs positioned Genesis 1:11 as a theological counterpoint, reinforcing Israel's monotheistic identity. Theological innovation. Genesis 1:11's monotheism, moral focus, and universal covenant distinguish it from ancient Near Eastern myths, offering a vision of humanity as unified under one God, with Israel as a redemptive agent. This innovation shapes the Torah's theology and narrative. Cultural impact. This innovation influenced Western religious and ethical traditions, from the Torah's laws to global human rights, ensuring Genesis 1:11's enduring legacy. 8. Enduring relevance and modern applications. Genesis 1:11 remains a living text, its themes and lessons resonating in Jewish practice, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues. Its adaptability ensures its significance in addressing modern challenges while rooted in ancient wisdom. Jewish practice and identity. Genesis 1:11 is central to Jewish liturgy and study, with Parshiot Bereshit and Noach engaging communities through synagogue readings. Creation and covenant themes shape Birakot, Brit rituals, and festivals, for example, Rosh Hashanah. Ethical norms, sanctity of life, Teshuvah, Tikkun Olam, inform Jewish law and advocacy, while the transition to Abraham reinforces covenantal identity, seen in prayers and naming practices. The Primeval history's universal scope inspires Jewish outreach, fostering interfaith and social justice initiatives. Interfaith and universal resonance. In Christianity, Genesis 1:11 shapes reflections on creation, sin, and redemption, influencing theology, liturgy, and ethics. For example, Romans 5:12-21. The flood and Babel inform narratives of judgment and diversity. In Islam, the Quran's accounts of creation, flood, and diversity, for example, Surah Al-Baqarah 2:30-39, Surah Hud 11:25-49, echo Genesis 1:11, fostering shared Abrahamic values. Interfaith initiatives draw on these themes to address global issues. Universal themes: creation, responsibility, diversity, provide common ground for ethical discussions, from human rights to environmental care, in interfaith and secular contexts. Contemporary issues: environmental stewardship, creation's goodness and the Noahide covenant, Genesis 1:9, inspire Jewish and global environmental movements, with organizations like Hazan citing Genesis 1:11 for climate action and sustainability. Ethics and justice, the sanctity of life, Genesis 9:6, and moral responsibility, Genesis 4:7, inform human rights, addressing violence, inequality, and social justice, with Jewish thinkers promoting chaste and accountability. Multiculturalism and diversity, the Table of Nations and Babel, Genesis 10:11, address multiculturalism, promoting inclusion and linguistic preservation in pluralistic societies. Science and technology, the tension between cultural achievements and sin, Genesis 4:17-22, resonates in debates on ethical innovation, from AI to biotechnology, with Jewish ethics emphasizing Bal Tashkit, do not destroy. Cultural and educational role. Genesis 1:11 inspires literature, for example, Milton's Paradise Lost, art, for example, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, and media, for example, the Bible series, shaping cultural narratives of origins and redemption. Its imagery, garden, ark, tower, resonates across genres. In education, Genesis 1:11 is studied in Jewish schools, yeshivas, and universities, fostering discussions of theology, anthropology, and ethics. Its accessibility engages diverse audiences, from children to scholars. 9. Broader cultural and religious impact. The Primeval history's impact extends beyond Judaism, shaping religious traditions, cultural narratives, and ethical thought worldwide. Jewish tradition. Genesis 1:11 is foundational to Jewish theology, liturgy, and ethics, influencing halakha, teshuvat, and tikkun olam. Its narratives are retold in synagogue readings, education, and festivals, ensuring communal vitality. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its significance, enriching Jewish thought and practice across generations. Interfaith influence. In Christianity, Genesis 1:11 shapes theology, liturgy, and ethics, influencing Western religious culture through art, literature, and missions. In Islam, the Quran's parallel narratives foster shared Abrahamic values, supporting interfaith dialogue on creation, ethics, and diversity. Global culture. Genesis 1:11's themes inspire literature, art, and media, shaping cultural narratives of human origins and destiny. Its ethical contributions inform global human rights, environmental policies, and philosophical debates, reflecting its enduring legacy. 10. Synthesis. Genesis 1:11 as the Torah's theological prologue. The Primeval history, Genesis 1:11, is the theological and narrative prologue to Genesis and the Torah, establishing the universal context for Israel's covenantal story. Its narratives, creation, fall, flood, Babel, and genealogies weave a tapestry of divine sovereignty, human responsibility, sin, judgment, mercy, and covenant, setting the stage for Abraham's call and Israel's mission. The literary artistry, vivid imagery, structural symmetry, wordplay, enhances its theological impact, ensuring its memorability and adaptability. Rooted in ancient Near Eastern traditions, it engages Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Canaanite motifs to assert a monotheistic vision, shaped by the exilic context to inspire hope and identity. Rabbinic and mystical interpretations deepen its meaning, ensuring its vitality in Jewish tradition, while its universal themes resonate in interfaith and secular contexts. In modern times, Genesis 1:11 addresses environmental, ethical, and cultural issues, affirming its relevance as a source of wisdom. As the Torah's foundation, it frames Israel's story as God's plan to redeem a fallen world, of